This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are cracking open the source material you shared with us about the monumental backlash against GWF Hegel.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at a philosophical debate here. We are stepping right into a knife fight in 19th century German academia.
That really is the mission. Textbooks often present the critique of Hegel as this purely intellectual thing. Did he define God correctly, or did he slip into pantheism?
Right.
But we're looking behind the curtain. We want to understand why that accusation, the charge of pantheism, was fundamentally a proxy battle.
A proxy for what?
For academic power, for personal rivalries, and maybe most crucially for these massive shifts in Prussian political allegiance.
Absolutely. The sources really detail how intense this reaction was, and it was specifically targeting his concept of God, which he called the absolute spirit. We have to start with the philosophical surface layer, though. I mean, why was Hegel labeled quite dramatically as Spinoza reincarnated?
Well, because the core philosophical accusation was that he just dangerously blurred the boundaries. For centuries, Orthodox Western theology insisted that God was transcendent.
Separate from the world.
Separate from the world, personal, a judge. Hegel's system, though, it treated the absolute spirit as the dynamic unfolding process of the world itself. It was realizing itself through history and logic.
So he essentially took God and turned him into a cosmic verb rather than a proper noun.
Precisely. And that approach immediately attracted three powerful, though, pretty distinct factions of critics.
Okay, so let's start with the one that gives this whole thing its historical weight. The anti-Spinoza faction. This ties back to a much older controversy, right?
It does, yeah. This faction was led by figures like J.G.F. Jacobi, and they were really just extending the 18th century pantheism controversy.
The pantheism is straight.
Exactly. Jacobi saw any grand systematic philosophy like Hegel's as inherently dangerous. The claim was that Hegel's system, where the individual self is just a necessary cog, a moment, in the machinery of the absolute spirit.
That was just too close to Spinoza.
It was too close to Spinoza's famous equation. God equals nature.
When you say the individual is merely a moment of the absolute spirit, how did that translate to a dangerous religious idea for them?
It meant you lose all individual agency. I mean, if
Yeah.
I am just a moment, a necessary phase or aspect of God's self-realization, then do I have free will? Do I have personal responsibility?
Is there even a soul to save?
Right. My reality is just completely absorbed by the system. For Jacobi, that wasn't philosophy. That was religious dissolution.
Then we have this fascinating case of, I guess you'd call it philosophical betrayal. F.W.J. Schelling, once a close friend and intellectual peer of Hegel's, he becomes one of his fiercest late-career critics. What was Schelling's angle on this?
Schelling's philosophical evolution had taken him in a profoundly different direction. He was moving toward a philosophy of absolute radical freedom and the absolute necessity of a personal God. So for Schelling, Hegel's system was a disaster, because it reduced God to merely the result of a logical system, just the final, necessary culmination of a philosophical argument.
So the complaint wasn't that God didn't exist in Hegel's system, but that God wasn't free.
Exactly. I mean, if God is just the inescapable conclusion of the dialectic, then he can't act freely, he can't truly choose, and he certainly can't be a person you can have a relationship with.
It's a mechanism.
It's a mechanism. Schelling feared that this rational reduction caused the divine personality to simply dissolve into the world, leaving behind only a cold, dead process.
And finally, the most institutionally powerful faction, the one with the most to lose, the Protestant theologians.
This was the Orthodox conservative wing, and they were largely supported by the Prussian state church. Their objection was very concrete. Hegel's system just destroyed Christian doctrine.
Yeah.
Well, if God lacks personality and transcendence, then the entire structure of salvation, judgment, prayer, even the clergy's role, it all collapses. If the world itself is the manifestation of God, then God is no longer above the world, providing guidance and forgiveness.
So for this group, the label pantheism was less a nuanced philosophical critique and more of a political weapon.
That's it.
A way to signal that Hegel was actively weakening the spiritual foundation of the Prussian kingdom.
That is precisely why the label was so effective. It was a one-word summation. Hegel is an atheist in disguise. He was seen as the reincarnation of Spinoza, because his system, whatever its intellectual subtlety, functionally eliminated the transcendent personal God that state-supported Christianity required.
Okay, so let's unpack this political reality. if this pantheism label was such a powerful poison, and if the critique was so widespread, why didn't it actually damage Hegel's career while he was alive?
Right.
That's what makes the contrast with his predecessor, Fichte, so striking.
That contrast is the linchpin of our entire analysis. It tells you that the political environment was the decisive factor in 19th century Prussia, not the sharpness of the philosophical argument.
So tell us about Fichte's exile. What specific conditions made his position so untenable during the 1799 atheism controversy?
The key was the timing. Fichte was operating in a politically paranoid environment. Just before the Napoleonic Wars brought some stability, the German states were highly fragmented and just terrified of anything that smelled like revolutionary French thought.
And Fichte's idea of God smelled like that to them.
Oh, absolutely. When he defined God as purely the moral law itself, implying a denial of the personal transcendent God, it was seen not just as heresy, but as a direct threat to the state.
But why was denying a personal God considered state-destroying?
Because the state relied on established religious authority to maintain social order and obedience. If God is only an abstract moral law, then who enforces that law? The worry was that if you remove the fear of transcendent judgment,
You'd unleash anarchy.
you'd unleash anarchy. Fichte was immediately targeted for thought control, and he was effectively exiled from Jena.
So Fichte was viewed as a dangerous revolutionary, someone undermining the monarchy's spiritual authority. But when Hegel arrives at the University of Berlin in 1818, he walks into a completely different scenario.
A dramatically different one. Hegel arrived when King Frederick William III, FW III, was stabilizing the Prussian state after the wars. The king and his administration saw Hegel's philosophy not as a threat, but as a vital tool.
For what?
For unity. They protected and favored him, viewing his system as a crucial spiritual pillar for national unification and stability. He was installed as the leading philosopher of the state.
And Hegel was, much more strategic in his language than Fichte was.
Oh, far more subtle. Fichte was starkly provocative. Hegel, however, he took enormous pains to position his absolute spirit so that its ultimate and highest form was the Christian idea.
So he wasn't attacking theology.
No, he was attempting to defend theology with philosophy, to show that Christianity was the ultimate rational expression of world history. It made him look like a reconciler, a stabilizing influence, which is exactly what the state needed and rewarded.
Okay, here's where it gets really, really interesting for me. If Hegel was protected by the state, getting all this funding and academic prestige, and he was seen as this pillar of unity, what was the actual mechanism of the fight against him? If the pantheism label couldn't remove him, what was the real complaint?
The real fight was about turf, budget, personal humiliation, and institutional pride. The pantheism critique was the perfect, respectable cover for a vicious academic turf war.
Let's elaborate on the turf war. We often forget that universities are, built on hierarchies and budgets.
Exactly. Consider the internal politics of the 19th century German university. Theology was historically the undisputed king faculty. It controlled the most prestige, the highest appointments, the largest budgets. It always ranked above law, medicine, and philosophy.
And then Hegel arrives.
Then Hegel arrives, and his success is just phenomenal. His lectures drew audiences of 500 to 600 students. That was unheard of.
So the theology faculty saw their audience, and by extension their budget and their institutional relevance, just walking across campus to the philosophy building.
It was an immediate threat. And compounding this was the personal history. Hegel had trained in theology at Tübingen, but then he switched to philosophy and reinterpreted Christianity within his logical system. So he was seen as a kind of traitor.
A traitor rewriting theology from a position of profound philosophical arrogance.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
This shifts the entire context. It wasn't just envy. It was wounded institutional pride.
Deeply wounded.
Absolutely. Think about the pride of the clergy and the faculty who believed they held the keys to eternal truth. The ultimate insult was this concept of the offensive way of being saved.
What was that?
Hegel's system treated religion, meaning theology, as merely representation, like intuitive images, and argued that its deepest truth could only be completed by philosophy through pure concept.
So philosophy, the traditional subordinate faculty, was claiming that the king faculty theology was incomplete and needed rescuing by the younger upstart department.
Precisely. This arrangement placed theology permanently subordinate to philosophy. It reduced its truth to a preliminary stage. This was just profoundly humiliating. They felt they didn't need saving by some systematic philosopher who had turned their faith into a logical step in a cosmic process.
But the personal envy was definitely a powerful catalyst, especially for Schelling, who was forced to watch his former colleague become the state's intellectual superstar.
Schelling had been waiting in the weeds for decades. His post-Hegel critiques, where he dismissively called Hegel's work a dead logical system, were undeniably fueled by rivalry over who was the true intellectual heir to Kant and Fichte.
Yeah.
When your rival becomes the establishment figure, you don't just critique the logic, you wait for the political opening to execute a takedown.
And that opening was the political climate change. Hegel dies in 1831, but the backlash doesn't fully explode until 1840. What was the pivotal event?
The death of King Frederick William III in 1840. That was the decisive turning point. As long as F.W. III was alive, Hegel's spiritual pillar was protected. But the new king, Frederick William IV, was a staunch conservative, deeply romantic.
And he explicitly disliked Hegel's dry, rationalistic approach to God.
Hated it. So suddenly, the philosophical ground just shifted. Being anti-Hegel wasn't just respectable, it was politically profitable.
That's the key takeaway, isn't it? The subsequent academic backlash wasn't some sudden rediscovery of a flaw in Hegel's system.
No, it was naked opportunism. The critics, who had been silenced or marginalized under the previous regime, immediately saw a chance to curry favor with a new power holder.
And who is the greatest example of this political payoff?
Schelling. In a massive display of political theater and revenge, Schelling was invited to Berlin in 1841, specifically to serve as the anti-Hegel standard-bearer.
Wow.
The new king gave him the platform to launch a spectacular state-sponsored attack on the dead state philosopher. The charge of pantheism finally had the political payload it needed.
So what does this all mean for the bigger picture? Let's connect this back to the grand project of German idealism. It seems Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel all shared this single desperate mission to save religion using philosophy from the corrosive acids of the Enlightenment.
They did. The consensus, from Kant onward, was that the traditional idea of a personal God just could not withstand rational criticism. But, as we saw with Fichte, outright atheism was politically explosive and socially destructive.
So what's the option?
The only viable option was pantheization, redefining God not as a separate entity, but as the internal structure of the world, or moral consciousness, or absolute reason.
It was a philosophical compromise, but the theologians rejected that compromise entirely.
Rigidly so. They insisted that the personal God was the non-negotiable cornerstone. Without a personal God, you lose prayer, you lose forgiveness, you lose the institutional authority of the clergy. For them, pantheism in any form was simply religion without religion.
It retained the vocabulary but discarded the core experience.
Exactly. And a wonderful historical twist, this intense intellectual feud between Hegel and Schelling actually mirrors much older structural divides within Western thought.
This is where we get to the deep structural insight.
Right. Hegel's system was fundamentally Thomistic in its structure. Like Thomas Aquinas centuries earlier, Hegel created a vast, comprehensive, closed system logic, philosophy of right, that tried to synthesize faith and reason.
And in doing so, he made the highest truths of Christianity a necessary rational component of the entire logical structure.
He did. And what was the criticism against Aquinas? That he made God too necessary.
Right.
Hegel faced the same charge. He made God a necessary object of reason, stripping away God's free will and personality. It's a systematic Aristotelian approach.
Which makes Schelling the natural opposite.
Precisely. Schelling's late philosophy, emphasizing radical freedom, mystical intuition, and this primal, uncaused deep ground of existence, it aligned perfectly with the traditionalist, often romantic, Neoplatonic philosophical strand.
And, crucially, it aligned with the new king's personal, romantic, and anti-rational religious sensibilities.
That was the key. So the political battle waged in 1841, where the anti-Hegel faction finally seized power, was a philosophical replay of the historic divide. The systematic, synthesizing tradition of Hegel and Aquinas was overthrown by the intuitive, romantic, and traditionalist tradition of Schelling and Neoplatonism.
So it was a fascinating structural collision, just masked as a political purge.
Yes. The deep dive shows that the critique of Hegel's pantheism was a complex cocktail of genuine philosophical concern, professional jealousy, institutional humiliation, and ultimately political opportunism that struck when the king's favor shifted.
This confirms that the fight was less about whether Hegel's system was philosophically sound and more about who controlled the academic and spiritual narrative of the Prussian state.
It was a profound challenge to authority and pride. Fichte faced a genuine theological challenge that the state saw as a revolutionary threat. Hegel faced an institutional challenge that only became potent when his political protection vanished after 1840, allowing the wounded theological establishment to finally take their revenge.
That makes you think. The shared philosophical project of German idealism was to make Christianity safe for the modern rational state. If the only way philosophy could save God was by stripping him of his personality and transcendence, was that rescue mission ultimately a success or merely a prolonged surrender?
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.